After sitting Shiva for her beloved son Hirsch, who was murdered in Hamas captivity, Rachel Goldberg Poland penned a letter to her synagogue community. She wrote in part, "To my beautiful Hakel family, how do I begin to thank you for every single thing? From the late morning of October 7th, you showed up. Since then, those of you I knew and didn't know have prayed for Hirsch and us, cooked, advocated, took to the streets, cried for us, and tried for us. Thank you, you unbelievably generous, kind, tender, caring, thoughtful, benevolent, brilliant, and loving people. Thank you endlessly and always for holding us, however you have during this dark chapter. Each gesture mattered and was felt. In a world that can be desperately cruel, a world in which pain and heartbreak know no bounds, a world of savagery and senseless murder, Rachel's letter is a touching testament to the humble yet transformative power of kindness. It is a kindness found in the gentle hugs of a neighbor and the outstretched arms of a friend, in home-cooked meals left by the door, and in bedtime prayers whispered by loved ones and loving strangers alike. And as Rachel expressed so movingly in her message, since that dreadful morning of October 7th, when Hirsch was brutally abducted to Gaza, every act of kindness shown to her, no matter how large or small, mattered, and it mattered deeply. These kindnesses helped her and her family feel loved and cared for and less alone in their nightmare. Likewise, they gave her and her family a steady mooring at a time when their lives felt completely adrift. Every gesture was felt, Rachel says, and it was these acts of kindness, as she said in her eulogy for Hirsch, that carried her family through this exceptionally difficult hour. In a time of war, writes Rabbi Amy Eilberg, in a community devastated by trauma, grief, and fear, few things are more meaningful than spreading kindness. And few things are more important, especially now when so many of us are hurting. Reflecting on her state of mind in the aftermath of October 7th, Rabbi Eilberg shares, "I didn't have the power to do the things I most wanted to do. I could not turn back the clock and prevent the Hamas attack. I could not personally find and rescue the hostages. I could not heal the bottomless grief of the bereaved. I could not stop the killing and suffering of people throughout Gaza. I could not do any of those things, but I could offer kindness to people lost in sadness, fear, and anger." What is Judaism ultimately about? And what is it really for? Asks Rabbi Shai Held in his new book. He answers, Judaism is about love, and its goal is to make us kinder and more present for one another. Rabbi Held explains his thesis with a teaching from our Talmud, which reads, "The beginning of Torah is acts of loving kindness, and the end of Torah is acts of loving kindness." That is to say, if the Torah is bookended with profound acts of love and kindness, with God graciously clothing a naked Adam and Eve at the beginning, and God tenderly burying Moses at the end, then one can conclude that the entire purpose of Torah is to bring love and kindness into the world. And if the entire purpose of Torah is to bring love and kindness into the world, then we, as students of this Torah, must commit ourselves to living out this directive, to cultivating lives full of love and kindness. In Judaism, kindness, or chesed in Hebrew, is a mitzvah, a commandment. Therefore, it's not only a virtue, but a mandate. We are compelled to lead lives of empathy and compassion, caring for the sick, visiting the bereaved, celebrating with brides and grooms. Kindness is what makes the world livable and meaningful and tolerable. Our tradition underscores this necessity for kindness in a teaching from Pirkei Avot. It reads, "The world stands on three things: on Torah, on worship, and on acts of chesed, kindness. These three things keep our world in balance, ensuring the delicate equilibrium we call life. But if just one of these things were to crumble, the whole world would crumble with it." Our tradition asserts we need chesed, we need kindness in our lives. We simply cannot survive without it. And sometimes we only survive because of it. In the wake of his daughter Nomi's sudden death at age 30, writer Leonard Fine of blessed memory was reeling. Of this time, he wrote, "In the face of the death of a loved one, we feel our desperate, profound, existential aloneness. The embrace of others, friends, and also kind strangers saves us from descending forever into that darkness. It is almost physical, as if we're being grabbed, pulled back from the brink, as cold as we have been left, and colder still as we sense we're becoming. The kindness of others acts as a blanket, enveloping us in warmth, restoring us to life." Some of us have been wrapped in that blanket before. We have felt its warmth and been comforted by its softness. And we know when its thick fibers are enfolded about us, we feel calmer, but also more alive. Kindness can restore us and renew us and revive us. It can ferry us through the most uninhabitable seas of loneliness and lift us up when life knocks us down. Kindness can make us feel human when our grief has made us feel alien. And kindness can remind us that even in our darkest moments, there is still yet light in the world, still yet hope. The eternal hope found in a single gesture of kindness reminds me of a story I heard just a couple months ago. My colleagues and I were meeting with an extraordinary candidate for conversion named Darlene. Darlene had come to Emanu-El after a long and winding path of searching. She had grown up in Brazil, always knowing that her ancestors were Jewish. This one lit candles every Friday, this one baked a challah every Shabbat, and this one refrained from eating pork and shellfish. Still, the Jewish pieces of her life were mostly secret, and Darlene yearned to know more. When she moved to the United States, Darlene set out on a journey of self-discovery. She began excavating her past, uncovering bits and pieces of her heritage, searching for ways to make sense of it all. In those early days, she knocked on many doors. Most didn't open. Others might open, only to be slammed in her face. She was distraught, knowing her history and identity, but feeling as if she would never be able to claim it. But one moment, says Darlene, changed everything. It was a few years ago, on a day she remembers as being thoroughly awful. Her life was a shambles, and she had long lost hope in finding a path to Judaism. But for some reason, on that day, she took a different route home, which happened to take her past a synagogue. She was drawn to it, and so she stopped for a moment and peered inside. There she saw a room abuzz with parents, caregivers, and children, laughing and playing. The scene was so sweet, it made Darlene cry. And then, as Darlene was about to leave, a woman noticed her and waved her inside. "Come in," she said. Seeing the tears stream down Darlene's face, the woman offered her a place to sit and rest. They got to talking, and this woman, sensing Darlene's yearning for community, invited her to, of all things, Yom Kippur worship. As Darlene shares, "She saved a seat for me, and we sat together. It meant everything, everything. I had lost all hope, but this woman helped me find it again." Isn't it remarkable how one act of kindness can thrust a lifetime of closed doors open? Darlene officially joined the Jewish community this past August, and she is a blessing. Sometimes acts of kindness draw us closer to our faith and to God, but sometimes we find God in the very acts of kindness themselves. Tiny Beautiful Things is a collection of essays written by author Cheryl Strayed, answering readers' deepest questions about life. In one such essay, Strayed responds to a young mother whose daughter had recently undergone life-threatening surgery. The mother wondered if the success of the surgery could be taken as evidence of God's existence and the power of prayer. Strayed's reply to her reader is thoughtful and surprising. "Dear reader," she begins, "what if you allowed God to exist in the simple words of compassion others offer to you? What if those emails from people who had nothing to give you but their kind words, along with all the prayers people were praying for you, what if together they formed a tiny raft that could just barely hold your weight as you floated through those terrible hours while you awaited your daughter's fate? If I believed in God, I'd see evidence of God's existence in that. In your darkest hour, you were held afloat by the human love that was given to you when you most needed it." Strayed, though by her own admission not particularly religious, here echoes the theology of Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who teaches, "Our hands are the hands of God, and so too our words and our prayers." Could it be that God is revealed through the kindnesses we show one another? That every hug offered and every prayer recited is not just evidence of God, but an expression of God, not just God inspired, but God at work? Could it be that these kindnesses are what poet Danusha Lamaris calls the true dwelling of the holy? These fleeting temples we make together when we say kind things like, "Here, have my seat. Go ahead, you first." Could it be that kind words and kind actions are by definition holy words and holy actions? On this day, when we are striving for holiness and yearning to be the best versions of ourselves, there is no better, more moral path than the one paved in kindness. As Rabbi Shai Held reminds us, God's call and challenge to us is to live lives of love manifested in acts of kindness. And it seems readily apparent that this mandate is more urgent now than it has ever been. We are living in brutal times. Israel is at war on several fronts. Our hostages continue to languish in Gaza. Tens of thousands in Israel are still displaced, and thousands of Palestinians continue to suffer from hunger and homelessness. Meanwhile, anti-Semitism rages on with ever more vitriol and menace. Add to this litany ever-growing political divisiveness, ongoing threats to reproductive freedom, continued war in Ukraine. The list goes on and on. We are worn down, exhausted by the unrelenting chaos and cruelty in our post-October 7th world. Thus, if there ever were a time for kindness, that time is now, when so many of us feel so broken and desperate and alone. We need kindness to keep us going, to give us hope, to sustain our faith in both God and humanity, and to carry us through. Our tradition teaches that the world would collapse without kindness. We would collapse too. In the echoes of this sanctuary, we can hear God's full-throated call summoning us to be loving and kind, saying now is the time to tend to one another and care for each other. Now is the time to reach out to one another, to extend our hands to those suffering in our midst with loneliness or heartache, grief or despair. Now is the time to make space for one another, to listen with attentiveness and patience, even when we don't necessarily want to hear. Now is the time to see one another, to look beyond the labels and slogans and affirm each other's humanity. Now is the time to be gentle with one another, to recognize our shared fragility, anxiety, and fear. And now is the time to hold each other, to embrace one another through the darkness until the light emerges once again. Today, the greatest moral imperative for each of us is kindness. Our mandate is to love and care for one another and to encourage and strengthen one another. Though this moment may be utterly fraught, and though we may feel utterly spent, this is precisely the moment to practice kindness. And the harder this mandate feels, the more urgent it becomes. Let us resist the cruelty of the world with kindness. And let us rebel against its inhumanity with compassion, empathy, and love. In her exquisite eulogy for Hirsch, Rachel Goldberg Poland thanked her community for all the kindness shown to her and her family during these horrendous months of waiting and worrying. That kindness had been life-saving and life-giving. It had sustained them through the most terrible of times. But now, entering what she called a new, sickening chapter, she pleaded with her community, saying, "I'm so thankful to you, and I apologize deeply, but we will need continued help. I beg of you all, please don't leave us now." Dear friends, we too are entering a volatile and uncertain new chapter of life. As these wars drag on, as tensions rise throughout the Middle East, as we lose patience and sleep, as we grow more jaded, as our tolerance for difference diminishes, as we grow further apart in ideology, as we get angrier and more self-righteous and see our lives through an ever-narrowing lens, we may be tempted to turn away from each other. But I beg of you all, please, let's not leave each other now. God knows we're so very drained from a year that has taken so much out of us, but please, let's not abandon one another or forfeit our belief in humanity. Let's not resort to indifference or disdain. We need each other now. And if life gets harder or our souls get wearier, then we'll have to work harder to care for each other. And if the world grows harsher and our hearts grow heavier, then we'll have to dig deeper to tend to one another. And if it all feels impossible, and it will most certainly feel impossible, then we simply cannot give up, because we need each other's kindness now more than ever. Poet Naomi Shihab Nye teaches, in a time of tremendous sorrow, it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. On this day of atonement, as the world rages and roils outside, nothing makes much sense. But the kindness we share with one another, that which lightens our burdens and sweetens our joys, that which lifts our spirits and soothes our souls, this makes perfect sense. And so may we, in sacred community, aspire today and every day to make such sense of our lives as we give of ourselves, as we share of our time, as we reach out our hands, as we open our hearts, and as we boldly lead with love, with compassion, and most urgently of all, with kindness. Gamar Chatima Tova, may we all be sealed for goodness and blessing and a life overflowing with kindness.